Conspiracy College. None dare call it conspiracy. Chapter 3. The Money Manipulators. Alright. Many college history professors tell their charges that the books they will be using in class are objective. But stop and ask yourself, is it possible to write a history book without a particular point of view? There are billions of events which take place in the world each day. To think of writing a complete history of a nation covering even a year is absolutely incredible. Not only is a historian's ability to write objective history limited by the sheer volume of happenings, but by the fact that many of the most important happenings never appear in the papers, or even in somebody's memoirs. The decisions reached by the big boys in the smoke-filled rooms are not reported even in the New York Times, which ostensibly reports all the news that is fit to print. All the news that fits is a more accurate description. In order to build his case, a historian must select a minuscule number of facts from a limited number that are known. If he does not have a theory, how does he separate important facts from unimportant ones? As Professor Stuart Crane has pointed out, this is why every book proves the author's thesis. But no book is objective. No book can be objective, and this book is not objective. Liberal reviewers should have a ball quoting that out of context. The information in it is true, but the book is not objective. We have carefully selected the facts to prove our case. We believe that most other historians have focused on the landscape and ignored that which is most important: the cart, the boy, and the donkey. Most of the facts which we bring out are readily verifiable at any large library. But our contention is that we have arranged these facts in the order which most accurately reveals their true significance in history. These are the facts the establishment does not want you to know. Have you ever had the experience of walking into a mystery movie 2/3 of the way through? It was confusing, wasn't it? All the evidence made it look as if the butler were the murderer, but in the final scenes you find out surprisingly that it was the man's wife all along. You have to stay and see the beginning of the film. Then, as all the pieces fall into place, the story makes sense. This situation is very similar to the one in which millions of Americans find themselves today. They are confused by current happenings in the nation. They have come in as the movie, so to speak, is going into its conclusion. The earlier portion of the mystery is needed to make the whole thing understandable. Actually, we are not really starting at the beginning, but we are going back far enough to give meaning to today's happenings. In order to understand the conspiracy, it is necessary to have some rudimentary knowledge of banking, and particularly of international bankers. While it would be an oversimplification to ascribe the entire conspiracy to international bankers, they nevertheless have played a key role. Think of the conspiracy as a hand with one finger labeled international banking. Other foundations, the religion movement, the Fabian socialism, and communism. And there are many more fingers. But it was the international bankers of whom Professor Quigley was speaking when we quoted him earlier as stating that their aim was nothing less than control of the world through finance. Where do governments get the enormous amounts of money they need? Most, of course, comes from taxation, but governments often spend more than they are willing to tax from their citizens, and so are forced to borrow. Our national debt is now $455 billion, every cent of it borrowed at interest from somewhere. It's a little bit more than that now. The public is led to believe that our government borrows from the people through savings bonds. Actually, only the smallest percentage of the national debt is held by individuals in this form. Most government bonds, except those owned by the government itself through its trust funds, are held by vast banking firms known as international banks. For centuries, there has been big money to be made by international bankers in the financing of governments and kings. Such operators are faced, however, with certain thorny problems. We know that smaller banking operations protect themselves by taking collateral. But what kind of collateral can you get from a government or king? What if the banker comes to collect and the king says, "Off with his head"? The process through which one collects a debt from a government or monarch is not a subject taught in the business schools of our universities, and most of us never have been, having been in the business of financing kings, have not given the problem much thought. But there is a king financing business, and to those who can ensure collection, it is lucrative indeed. Now, this is just deep philosophical stuff about every kingdom, since the medieval times in Rome, they had to have money.
Mm-hmm.
So, as soon as you get to a point where there's a conglomeration of kingdoms, you get people loaning money. It's just, if you can get something a kingdom needs and get a kingdom in your debt, it means you own the kingdom. I mean, if you control the money, you control everything. So it's just an ancient thing, and it's not just taught. How do you get into that business of shifting money around, globally? But it happens. It's been happening for a long time, and something we never think about. Economics professor Stuart Crane notes that there are two means used to collateralize loans to governments and kings. Whenever a business firm borrows a big money, its creditor obtains a voice in management to protect his investment. Like a business, no government can borrow big money unless willing to surrender to the creditor some measure of sovereignty as collateral. Certainly international bankers who have loaned hundreds of billions of dollars to governments around the world command considerable influence in the policies of such governments. But the ultimate advantage the creditor has over the king or president is that if the ruler gets out of line, the banker can finance his enemy or rival. Therefore, if you want to stay in the lucrative king financing business, it is wise to have an enemy or rival waiting in the wings to unseat every king or president to whom you lend. If the king doesn't have an enemy, you must create one. Preeminent in playing this game was the famous House of Rothschild. Its founder, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, 1743 to 1812, of Frankfurt, Germany, kept one of his 5 sons at home to run the Frankfurt Bank and sent the others to London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. The Rothschilds became incredibly wealthy during the 19th century by financing governments to fight each other, according to Professor Stuart Crane. If you look back at every war in Europe during the 19th century, you will see that they always ended with the establishment of a balance of power. With every reshuffling, there was a balance of power in a new grouping around the House of Rothschild of England. The House of Rothschild in England, France, or Austria. They grouped nations so that if any king got out of line, a war would break out, and the war would be decided by which way the financing went. Researching the debt positions of the warring nations will usually indicate who was to be punished. And this is all historically factual. You can do history on. It's just not in the history books. You can go back to history books and you'll hear a lot of stories about wars going on with Napoleon and wars going on in Europe, and of course the American Revolution, the Civil War. If you really find where the money is getting shifted around, you'll see it's all around the House of Rothschild and a few other bankers financing different kingdoms and just pulling strings. And it's been happening a long time. So it's an important name, this Rothschild. In describing the characteristics of the Rothschilds and other major international bankers, Dr. Quigley tells us that they remain different from ordinary bankers in several ways. They were cosmopolitan and international. They were close to governments and were particularly concerned with government debts, including foreign government debts. These bankers came to be called international bankers. One major reason for the historical blackout on the role of the international bankers in political history is that the Rothschilds were Jewish. Anti-Semites have played into the hands of the conspiracy by trying to portray the entire conspiracy as Jewish. Nothing could be further from the truth. The traditionally Anglo-Saxon J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller International Banking Institution have played a key role in the conspiracy, but there is no denying the importance of the Rothschilds and their satellites. However, it is just as unreasonable and immoral to blame all Jews for the crimes of the Rothschilds as it is to hold all Baptists accountable for the crimes of the Rockefellers. The Jewish members of the conspiracy have used an organization called the Anti-Defamation League as an instrument to try to convince everyone that any mention of the Rothschilds or their allies is an attack on all Jews. In this way, they have stifled almost all honest scholarship on international bankers and have made the subject taboo within universities. It's pretty easy to understand, though. Right? Yeah. Any individual or book exploring this subject is immediately attacked by hundreds of ADL committees all over the country. The ADL has never let truth or logic interfere with its highly professional smear jobs. When no evidence is apparent, the ADL, which staunchly opposed so-called McCarthyism, accuses people of being latent anti-Semites. Can you imagine how they would yowl and scream if someone accused them of being latent communists? Actually, nobody has a right to be more angry at the Rothschild clique than their fellow Jews. The Warburgs part of the Rothschild empire helped finance Adolf Hitler. There were few, if any, Rothschilds or Warburgs in the Nazi prison camps. They sat out the war in luxurious hotels in Paris or immigrated to the United States or England. As a group, Jews have suffered most at the hands of these power seekers. A Rothschild has much more in common with a Rockefeller than he does with a tailor from Budapest or the Bronx. Since the keystone of the international banking empires has been government bonds, it has been in the interest of these international bankers to encourage government debt. The higher the debt, the more the interest. Nothing drives government deeply into debt like a war, and it has not been an uncommon practice among international bankers to finance both sides of the bloodiest military conflicts. For example, during our Civil War, the North was financed by the Rothschilds through their American agent August Belmont, and the American South through the Erlangers, Rothschild relatives. But while wars and revolutions have been useful to international bankers in gaining or increasing control over governments, the key to such control has always been control of money. You can control a government if you have it in your debt. A creditor is in a position to demand the privileges of monopoly from the sovereign. Money-seeking governments have granted monopolies in state banking, natural resources, oil concessions, and transportation. However, the monopoly which the international financiers most covet is control over a nation's money. Eventually, these international bankers actually owned as private corporations the central banks of the various European nations. The Bank of England, the Bank of France, and the Bank of Germany were not owned by their respective governments, as almost everyone imagines, but were privately owned monopolies granted by the heads of state, usually in return for loans. Under this system, observed Reginald McKenna, president of the Midlands Bank of England, those that create and issue the money and credit direct the policies of the government and hold in their hands the destiny of the people. Once the government is in debt to the bankers, it is at their mercy. A frightening example was cited by the London Financial Times of September 26, 1921, which revealed that even at the time, half a dozen men at the top of the big five banks could upset the whole fabric of government finance by refraining from renewing treasury bills. Got that weight in it. Let this one load.